Hello, my name is Callum Parker, and I'm presenting our paper titled Foundations for Designing Public Interactive Displays that Provide Value to Users. The paper is co-authored with Martin Tomitsch, Nigel Davies, Nina Valkanova, and Judy K. Public interactive displays, or PIDs, are a commonly used technology for enabling people to interact with dynamic information within public spaces. In the context of our work, we define a PID as a form of public display that accepts some type of input. Furthermore, PIDs can come in all different shapes and sizes, utilized for a range of different purposes, such as wayfinding and interactive advertising in shopping centers. And they can also be used for allowing communities to leverage them for sharing information. For instance, the Digified's PID enabled users to share information with the screen, such as advertisements, news, and current events. But PIDs are not without their problems, however. The pervasive display community has long been tackling display blindness, which is similar to banner blindness on the web. Research studies have focused on studying this effect and ways to overcome it. However, in our earlier work, we found that not all public displays suffer from this effect, particularly in situations where people find a perceived value, such as someone waiting on an escalator, where they're essentially a captive audience. So there's been a lot of work done in this space, highlighting the potential of this technology to engage urban dwellers and become more than just a tool for advertising. In our paper, we build on and extend this previous body of work, developed over the past 15 years. Specifically, we aim to develop a structured understanding about the factors that affect the value PIDs provide to users, and those that might just be passing by. I'll now discuss the methodology of each stage of the analysis. So we started by performing a literature review of work that featured in the wild PID deployments. This was a three-step process. Using ACM Advanced Search, the first step was to identify the venues in which public display research was commonly published in the last 5 years, as we're interested in the current trends. This resulted in a selection of 5 top venues: CHI, PIDs, DIS, MUM, and Ubicomp. In the second step, we used the Google Scholar Advanced Search feature to narrow down papers to those that we described in the wild studies, as these offer a higher ecological validity. This also allowed us to confine the results to certain venues. This step resulted in 145 papers across 5 venues. While the search allowed us to greatly narrow the list of papers down, not all papers in this list were relevant. We were specifically looking for papers that, contained in the wild deployment, were studied in a public space, and published as a full peer-reviewed paper. This was to ensure that there were enough details for us to work with. Our literature review resulted in a sample of 25 papers. While the papers all had their own specific objectives, they all offered some insights into their deployment. A broad range of countries were represented in our sample of papers as well, with a majority of papers coming from Europe. We also found that the types of space PIDs were deployed in ranged from university campuses, swimming halls, airports, and train stations, just to name a few. We analysed the papers in a 2-stage process. First, one of the authors performed an inductive thematic analysis on the results, discussion, and conclusion of each paper using NVivo. This led to an initial list of codes. Following this, the second stage involved a second round of analysis with another author, where we reviewed the codes from the last stage to verify their relevance. We used affinity diagramming to group the codes into aspects and aspects into factors. From our literature review, we identified 4 factors: people, location, community, and time. These factors are intertwined and affect each other, and now I'll briefly describe each factor and aspect. So the people factor describes the individual or group who engages with the PID and the value it offers them. It is important to consider these 5 aspects. So the first one is trust. Is the PID in a controlled environment? Privacy. Does the PID look legitimate? Who is around? And does the PID have any privacy-preserving functionality? Relevance. Is the content relevant to the space and the user's current needs and goals? Appropriation. Can people create their own fun with the PID? And finally, ownership. Can users or communities contribute their own data, and what control do they have? Next factor is the location factor, which describes the composition of a physical location and how the aspect of location affects the value of a PID. It is important to choose a location of a PID carefully and consider the locations of people that people need to spend more time and are essentially a captive audience. So things like queues or people waiting on escalators. The community factor sits at the intersection of people and location. It describes a collection of users that share the same space as the PID. This factor is made up of two aspects. The first is identity. Content on a PID can say a lot about the location and the people in it, representing the community's identity. How can the community utilize it? Second one is collaboration. Does the PID spark discussion, and can multiple people use it, and in what ways? Finally, time is a factor that captures the fact that public spaces and people within them change over time, like a user's goals or events happening in that space. To illustrate the factors and aspects found in our literature review, we reflected on our case studies. As we were directly involved in these PID deployments, we could reflect on the value they offered users and how their design may have affected their value. I'll now briefly introduce each deployment. The transit PID offered value to users by implicitly adapting its transit information and place recommendations to the goals of the person using it. The media ribbon was implemented through a rear projection on a glass wall of a university building. The value proposition of this PID is that it allows for playful mid-air gestural interactions while providing serious content related to the area it's located in. My Position displayed an urban poll visualization on local issues. The value proposition of this PID is that it allows people to playfully vote on a topic using their whole body. The total results are visualized publicly on screen. Reveal It allowed people to submit their power usage information through a tablet nearby the PID. The value proposition for this PID is that people can collectively contribute their personal information to a growing visualization. Finally, eCampus is a network of 65 public displays. It is enhanced through the Tacita architecture, which allows users to personalize nearby public displays through a smartphone app with content that is of value to them. For instance, displaying the local weather or getting the relevant bus times. Now I'll discuss the design recommendations that emerge from our literature review, as well as the reflection on our own PID deployments. So the first design recommendation is that it's important for PIDs to adapt their content towards the user's many different goals, which may change over time. Secondly, while personalization can add value, it is also important to consider an individual's privacy requirements and how personalization may impact these. A user's privacy requirements could be discerned by the context and the number of people around them. Content is not necessarily the only valuable aspect. The interaction and experience are equally important contributors. People often engage with a PID differently than intended. Therefore, PID designers should embrace this and offer some level of appropriation. The value a PID offers is greatly influenced by the physical placement of the PID and how the space is used. While placing a PID in areas of high foot traffic increases engagement, it's not always done in practice. Therefore, it's important to scope out the space first and see who uses it and how that changes over time. A challenge for PIDs is their integration or situatedness within their respective communities and gaining relevant information about them, such as local events being held and demographics of people that make up these communities. PIDs should be designed so that they are more attuned to the communities in which they're situated in. Giving members of communities some form of control and ability to provide information enables PIDs to have greater knowledge of their respective communities and the associated preferences, giving them a greater pool of data to draw from when deciding what content to display. On that note, a continuous co-design approach with all community members and stakeholders would help keep the PID relevant potentially. Designing PIDs in a way that sparks discussion among users and bystanders can lead to increased engagement, augmenting the value that a PID can offer. It is also important to design PIDs to better accommodate these users with a larger physical space in front of the PID. Finally, it's important to understand the impact of time on the physical space and place, the people who use the space, and how these changes may affect the perceived value of a PID. It would also be a good idea to have some awareness of the user's current context and adapt according to the time constraints the user has. For instance, if the user needs to be somewhere in a hurry, the PID could present quick snippets of information. Now, along with the factors, aspects, and design recommendations, I'll end this talk with 2 key takeaways. Firstly, we found from reviewing the papers and our own work that quite a lot of deployments focused on community engagement. Therefore, this shows that PIDs can be a powerful tool when communities are given control and can give them a visual identity. Secondly, the pervasive display community has generated a lot of knowledge over the years. Compiling this knowledge together with our own experiences allowed us to generate grounded guidance for the design and the development of PIDs that can deliver value. We hope that the guidance can help researchers and practitioners optimize the value of their future PID deployments. We also hope that the community continues to further expand and improve upon the recommendations we provided. So thank you for listening. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions.